Moving on from carbohydrates, we come to our lipids or our fats. The big important thing to remember about fats is that they are held together by these specific bonds that are known as ester bonds. An ester bond contains an alcohol. Most commonly, it's going to be something like an OH, and then an acid. Remember, we talked about acids. They are proton donors. They like to give proteins. They decrease pH value. So oftentimes they have extra hydrogens, or they have lots of hydrogens on them. Here's the some of our AKAs, triacylglycerols, also known as triglycerides. This is that glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acid chains bound by ester bonds together. Remember that glycerol backbone is what is most commonly used for gluconeogenesis, and actually each of these the parts of these chains are actually made up of, we can actually cut them into 2 carbon units through a process called beta oxidation and get acetyl-CoA from them, which immediately can go directly into the Krebs cycle. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So fatty acids, they are 9 calories per gram, roughly make up about 30-ish%, 20 to 30% of a normal diet. They are composed of non-polar hydrocarbon tails attached to a polar carboxylic acid. That's C double bond OH right there. That we see all good and to go. When we talk about fats, we often talk about saturated versus unsaturated fats. This is specifically referring to the number of hydrogens that are attached to that chain. If it is saturated, that means it cannot hold any more hydrogens. As we know, every carbon has 4 valence electrons. So they're looking to bond with 4 different things. In most of the chains, they are bound to another carbon on either side, and so they will have 2 hydrogens. So if every single carbon is full up on hydrogens, that is a saturated fat. Okay? However, if for whatever reason we don't have this hydrogen, instead we form double bonds, this is now an unsaturated fat because it could hold more hydrogens, but it has a double bond, so it does not want to. This is where that term poly versus mono unsaturated fats come from. Mono unsaturated fats have 1 double bond in their long chain. Poly unsaturated fats have multiple double bonds throughout their chain. The trick with double bonds, and the way to tell if a substance has more double bonds or not when it comes to fats, is thinking about their room temperature as well as their freezing point. Or so I should say what state they are at room temperature and at what temperature they freeze. So think about olive oil versus butter. Butter has more saturated fats, and it is solid at room temperature. It has a higher freezing temperature, a lower freezing point. That gets a little bit confusing. Base it off of temperature. Temperature is typically what they'll ask, and it's a little bit easier. So solid fats have a higher freezing temperature, as well as and then the unsaturated fats have a lower melting temperature. So they're liquid at a lot lower temperatures. So think olive oil. Olive oil is mostly unsaturated fats, which is why it's liquid at room temperature. Butter is more saturated fats, which is why it is solid. The process of hydrogenation. We've all seen on our food especially in the States, hydrogenated oil or hydrogenated corn oil or something along those lines. What this is, it's a process that chemically we actually take potentially like unsaturated fats and we turn them into saturated fats. We force those extra hydrogens on there in order to primarily to increase the shelf life. This is also what causes trans fats, which is this process of hydrogenation and processing produces those not naturally occurring trans fats. So hydrogenation, adding more hydrogens into the fats. When we talk about fats, one of the big things that we talk about is oxidation reduction reactions. Remember the oil rig, oxidation is the loss of electrons or hydrogen, and reduction is the gain of electrons or hydrogen. Going from a saturated fat to an unsaturated fat is an example of an oxidation reaction because we are losing hydrogen. Going from an unsaturated to a saturated would be a reduction reaction. We're gaining hydrogen, gaining electrons. So generate an unsaturated fat is an oxidation reaction. The more unsaturated an oil is, the greater chance it is that it can go bad. The ones that tend to go bad, polyunsaturated fatty acids and then monounsaturated fatty acids. Because some of these comments are just random questions that they have asked in the past. Unlikely that you'll see this anyway, though at all. Coconut oil is the most saturated fat that is natural. Palm kernel oil is the second most. Oleic acid, which is an omega-9, makes up 55 to 80% of olive oil. Really, the big thing about fats that we're going to see right here, this is what we're going to want to know. Biggest things that were tested on: ester bonds, the naming of stuff, the glycerol backbone, the chains, saturated versus unsaturated, and what that means. And then kind of what does an oxidation versus reduction reaction mean. We also get to tested on essential fatty acids. Remember, we want to remember this mnemonic: all are essential. So there are 3 essential fatty acids, and it can get a little bit confusing because the first 2 sound very similar. So we're going to make sure we take our time with this. We have linoleic acid, which is an omega-6, found in things like sunflower oil, safflower oil, and corn oil. Then we have linolenic, which is an omega-3, which is a flax oil. And then we also have arachidonic acid, which is our omega-6, which comes from animal products such as dairy and red meat. Arachidonic acid is one of our most important acids because it is the precursor to all of our prostaglandins. So a lot of our immune system type functions, a lot of the chemicals and stuff that our body needs to produce and release for pain generation, for inflammation, for processing and healing, comes from arachidonic acid. So you definitely need to have these fats in our diet. Again, remember, we're talking about essential. That means our body cannot produce it naturally, so we have to consume it. This next little chart, this is unfortunately just a memorize type chart. Sometimes these get asked. The most common ones to get asked are the palmitic acid, stearic acid, and then the essential fatty acids. We want to remember the name as well as the number of carbons. So lauric acid has 12 carbons, myristic acid has 14, palmitic acid has 16 carbons, stearic acid has 18 carbons. You'll notice all of our fats come in pairs of 2s, and that's because when fats are produced in any kind of organic situation, the way that they are made, these fatty acid chains are made, is by pairing acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon molecule, pairing those together. So it builds by adding acetyl-CoA to each other. And so we're always going to see even numbers when we're talking about fats. Our unsaturated fats that we want to remember, oleic acid is 18, but with 1 double bond. Linoleic is also 18, but with 2 double bonds. Linolenic has 3 double bonds. And arachidonic has 20 carbons with 4 double bonds. Okay, we'll stop this one right here, and we'll continue talking about some of the other structures that fats are contained within.